speak a few words about Aravindan and also about the film. So to make it brief and also comprehensive, I have prepared text which I will just read out. Aravindan's films continue to captivate us in all their freshness and creative vibrancy. And in everything he did, whether it be cartooning, art direction, theater, drawing, music, or film, Aravindan was able to make new connections, infuse a certain kind of poignancy, a reflective pace, accompanied by an intense engagement with both with the senses and the intellect that gave his works haunting reverberations and unpredictable resonances. This ability to work with, through, and blend different mediums with ease gave his work a very distinct character and unique sensibility that is meditative yet deeply emotional. In a career spanning 2 decades, actually he made films. This is his first film, You So Vastahara. So between 74 and 91, he made around 11 feature films and many documentaries. Almost a span of 15 years, 15 to 16 years, Aravindan created a body of cinematic works that occupies a very unique position in Indian cinema. His debut film, Uttarayanam, which we are seeing today, made in 75, was about the degeneration of nationalist hopes and ideals, the rising despondence of the youth and their frustrated dreams. His next film was Kanjana Sita, which was made in 77. Aravindan dealt with the eternal dilemma of power and justice. It is a mythological of a different kind, one of the most innovative and experimental instances of adaptations in Indian cinema. You must have, mythologicals are a huge genre in Indian cinema, but this is radically different from all those formats. His next film, Tampu, The Tent, is about the ripples that a circus troupe creates in a placid village. Kumati, the next film, called Bogeyman, is a rare gem among children's films in India. It's a fable about a boy's brief excursion into the life of a dog. His next film, Estepan or Stephen, is another exploration into the world of local myths and myth-making. Followed by Pokuvel or Twilight, it's about a gradual falling apart of a sensitive young poet's mind whose inner and outer worlds crumble without any hope of redemption or overcoming. Interestingly, the film was shot to the accompaniment of music that is set in Rag Shubhapantuarali, rendered in Sarod by Rajiv Tarana, then flute by Hariprasad Chaurasia. The music was set first, and then film was edited according to the musical pace. Next film, Chidambaram, is a poignant elaboration upon the theme of innocence and guilt, about how an act of infidelity towards oneself and others traumatizes life, how an unethical move overturns the founding justifications of life. His next film, Oridattur, Once Upon a Time, Aravindan deals with the idea of progress and its demonic potentials. Here, the agent of change in the form of electricity arrives in a village, wreaking havoc with the fabric of life there. His next film, Maratham, weaves several kinds of narrative strands together, that is storytelling, performance, memory, and legends. The story within story narrative is about the boundaries between actor and acting, performance and reality, evidence and fact, story and truth, etc. His last film, Vastahara, which is screened here, translated as Dispossessed, looks at the theme of dispossession from various angles. At one level, the film is about displacement, exile, forced by partition. At another level, it is also about how we too dispossess each other, emotionally and otherwise. In film out of film, he excavated new experiential terrains, unfolded new connections, transgressed boundaries between genres, forms, and styles. In a way, one can also look at his films as creative dialogue between different mediums, of different art forms conversing with each other, probing at and extending boundaries, and creating new synergistic aesthetic engagements. If it is circus in Tampu, it is music and poetry in Pokuvel, Chautanadagam and songs in Estepan, Kathakali in Maratham, folktale songs and performances in Kumati, mythology and theater in Kanjana Sita. So almost all the films actually bring in other mediums into play. The greatness of an artist is in the aesthetic core of his or her works that acquires new dimensions with each viewing. It grows in time with the viewer or grows with time in the viewer. They do not get dated but acquire complex maturity along with us all the time, revealing new layers of meaning, emotional folds that outlive the ravages of time. In that sense, Aravindan will always remain a contemporary. Now, coming to Uttarayanam, the word means northward movement. It refers to a 6-month period between winter and summer solstices, when the sun moves northward in the sky. Uttarayanam is also considered to be an auspicious time of the year associated with, grace, enlightenment, and all that. In the film, there is this, at one moment, master or Guruji in the cartoon. This film is actually a continuation of the cartoon series called Cheriya Manishram Valiya Logo, Small Men, Big World, which Aravindan ran for almost 14 years, 61 to 73, in Madhubhumi Weekly, week after week, actually. There was only some for 10 or 20, 15 times that he missed out. So it is a kind of continuous kind of thing. It is one narrative with the central character being Ramu and his friends and family. So it ran for 14 years. So this film is actually a continuation of that cartoon series in a way, because many of those characters are there in the film too. So there is one moment where this master tells Ravi, it's more important to ask questions than find answers, which is also a way of summing up the film's theme. The film too is more about questions than about any definite answers, more about departures than about arrivals. Uttarayanam raises troubling questions about ethical life, its necessity and also possibilities, here and now. Throughout the film, we find Ravi restlessly searching for something in the world, in others, in relationships, and also in thought, ideals, and action. He is pained, frustrated, infuriated, but he is unable to act upon, connect, or identify with anything or anyone. As the title suggests, it is more about transitions and departures, never about closures and arrivals. Uttarayanam doesn't have a storyline as such, with a definite beginning, middle, or end. It is more about the journeys of Ravi in and through time and space, and his meetings with various people. That is how the film is structured. The film revolves around Ravi's journeys to the city and his encounters with people, interspersed with flashbacks that reveal key events from his father's and grandfather's political life. Both his formal and informal attempts fail to earn him. He's in search of a job, he's educated, he's jobless. He's in search of a job, nothing works. But the process and the people he meets during these attempts repels him, and he refuses to be part of the corrupt world. So finally, Ravi leaves home and his village, and also the city, to seek maybe life elsewhere. Film is also important in terms of the way in which it is made. In this film, a lot of artists, writers came together. It is actually an effort of a group of artists. Actually, direction itself is a combined effort association between Aravindan and G Aravindan, a FTA graduate. Then script was written by a very well-known playwright called Tikodian, who has written a lot of plays on political themes, historical themes and all that. Script was written jointly by Tikodian and Aravindan. It was produced by one of the most eminent writers in Malayalam called Pattatthivula Karunakaran. Art direction was done by the eminent artist Nambudiri. Music was done by K. Raghavan and B. Srinivasan. So it's a coming together of a lot of artists who are very active and also doing radical work in many fields, most of them pro-left activists and writers of that time. Film also draws from real events and personalities. The kind of character that you find Achu, the extremist activist in the film, is actually drawn from a real-life historical figure called Kunjirama Kedavu, who was part of a kind of attempt to bomb a bridge in 1943, which they did, and he went underground and came after India achieved independence. So this event that is shown in the film is actually a historical event, which is famous like Kidalur bomb case. And again, Kunjirama Kedavu's father was Kelappan, who was a very well-known Gandhian. So I think those kinds of parallels and characters are drawn from real life. And Aravindan himself says that Kunjirama Kedavu was there during the shooting, and a lot of things were done. Script was written in consultation with Kunjirama Kedavu. The film was released in April 1975, 2 months prior to the declaration of emergency. Thank you.
Well, as you know, this is as was mentioned earlier, this is the third film that we're screening as part of the series, The Radical 70s. And of course, absolutely no better person to discuss this particular film with than C.S. Venkiteswaran. CSV has been, apart from being, an incredibly significant figure in the independent cinema, in particular from Kerala, but not only from Kerala, and very, very familiar with Aravindan, on whom he has been working for a long time, and he's got a book that he said is almost done. He knows this film intimately. So there are two things to discuss, really. I mean, two kinds of things to discuss. Three, really. One is, in a way, what has been the kind of founding proposition of the series, which is that the political framework of the 1970s, which was, of course, I mean, in a sense, the 1970s begin much earlier. They begin in the late 1960s, and then you have the entire build-up to the emergency. You have the political upheavals that take place in Bihar and Gujarat, and then, of course, the emergency and the years leading up to it. There is a certain political framework within which this decade has been discussed. But this particular framework really does not explain these films. The kinds of situations that these films talk about, I mean, whether it's Interview, whether it is 27 Down or Uttarayanam, and yet other films, you mentioned Pratidwandi and other films, there is a certain kind of crisis that these protagonists face, which are not accounted for within the way that the 70s has been conventionally discussed. And I want to sort of get a little bit into that. So I want to start by asking you, in the years leading up to the emergency, you mentioned that Uttarayanam was made just before the emergency. Can you give us a little insight into the kind of political atmosphere in Kerala that defines the context of the film itself and Aravindan's own, this was his first film, his own kind of preoccupations at that point of time. So what are the impetus that went into the making of this film within the atmosphere of that time in early 70s Kerala? That I'd like to begin with that.
Yeah. There may be many things. Like one is the rise of modernist, literature, arts and all that. For instance, a lot of things happened by the in the late 60s. For instance, you have this very iconic novels coming up, like Kasakin Idihasam by O.V. Vijayan. Then you have this, huge sculpture, Yakshi, being installed in, Malambra Dam. So nude figure, there is it created a scandal, actually. So there was this influence of K.C. Spanikar, a lot of new poetry coming up, Sachidanandan, a whole lot of new generation of writers. So there is a kind of change of scene happening there. And a lot of theatre, actually. Kavalam Narayana Pedikar, G Shankarapillai, creating a new kind of theatre, radically different from the earlier KPSC stream and also the commercial theatre. So every front, art, literature, theatre, it was happening. Then late 60s, as you know, like there was this Naxalite movement becoming strong, and there were two actions. 68, 69 in Tellicherry, two actions happening, police station attacks happening. So there was a kind of very vibrant kind of situation there. There is on the one side that is happening. So there is a kind of atmosphere where all these things were being discussed. On the one, there is this disillusionment with post-nationalist project, and also with the Communist Party itself, Communist movement itself in Kerala becoming a kind of part of this whole power game. So this whole kind of disillusionment happened. A lot of people moving, inspired by a lot of things happening in Bengal and all that. All these were in the air, right? A lot of poems coming up. So that is in the air. Okay? And also in the political front, as I said, there is this, figures like Ajita, Kunnikal Narayan, and all those actions are happening. Yeah. So there is a kind of atmosphere within which this is, a lot of whether it be poetry or art and all that being discussed. So that atmosphere is reflected here. Second would be this film, I would say, if you look at Aravindan's 11 films, I would say there are 3 Aravindans. First Aravindan is the Uttarayanam Aravindan, where, this is a kind of, it is continuous to what he was doing in cartoons. That he was drawing from as I said, from 61 to 73. Just after that, they begin the shooting, planning of the film and shooting of the film. So this is actually a continuation of that film. There are many cartoonish characters, you can say, like Balaton or the revolutionary professor. All those are, even Guruji, this master is straight away from the cartoon. He almost looks like that, this mustache and all that, the same as in the cartoon. And this Ramu, who is the protagonist of the cartoon, is also very much like Ravi. So there is this kind of, in his filmmaking, this first film, which is actually a continuation of what he was doing. So all these many situations are like that. Even if you look at the structure of the film, the kind of episodic nature in which it is, done, it's also like if you flip through the cartoon, you can see such situations, 2, 3 characters meet. There's a kind of, some kind of, funny or, critical, social critical thing happening. That is the way in which cartoon is done. You can see many moments like that here also. So this is a kind of film which I would think is the first Aravindan, who is a continuation of his cartoon, the cartoonist Aravindan. Very loud black and white characters here. From that moment on, then the second Aravindan is much more interesting. Like starting from, say, Kanjanasida, Tampu, Pokuveil, Estapan, that is totally different kind of, Aravindan that you'll see. You'll never see situations like this there, dialogues like this there. Like, it's totally withdrawn, different kind of cinematics, and, the visualization itself is totally different. Maybe this was, cinematographer was Mangada Ravi Verma. Then Shaji joins him. From the second film throughout Shaji till the last film, which was done with Sunny Joseph. So there is a total change in the way in which the film is visualized and all that. All those films, those 4 or 5 films in the middle, when Ravindran Nair comes to produce the films, Aravindan has much more freedom to do whatever he likes. So all those films are very interesting. Totally, I think that is, he's at his, creative heights in a way. Then the third Aravindan is much more, he grows linear actually. He moves into much more linear narratives. Like you have seen Uridat, Chidambaram, Vastuhara, all these are very structured, moving towards a kind of linear narrative. So you can also see the first Aravindan here, who himself transforms himself in the next phases. So there is a kind of, that is how I would look back at Uttarayanam, which is actually 50 years old now. Like you're watching in 75 it was released. So it's almost 50 years.
Yeah. I mean, we will come to the cartoons in a minute, because it's really a remarkable story to be told about that particular cartoon series, and I'm going to bring that book and we're going to project some of the images in a few minutes. But I want to stay for a little bit with the first Aravindan, which I have to confess I find actually very interesting. I mean, I'm saying this because, it was something we were talking about, that, when you, I don't know whether you feel this way, but when you close your eyes and think a filmmaker, you imagine something. You close your eyes and think Fellini. For me, it's really the opening sequence of La Dolce Vita. You close your eyes and think Tarkovsky, and you get, some of those, the things, Solaris and so on. Close your eyes and think Aravindan. I'll get 2-3 images which actually move from Aravindan 1, 2, and 3. A kind of a peculiar amalgam. For me, for example, Tampu, and not necessarily the most important sequences. There's something very curious about that, that the Aravindan you remember isn't necessarily the most important sequence in any film. For me, it is, and I remember this very vividly, the raising of the tent and Gopi, basically just pointing it out. Or similarly, I think, we talked about this with Vastuhara, Mohanlal herding these migrants into the truck. In a curiously sort of unheroic way, something of that sort. And of course, to some extent, Kanchan Sita. What happens is that this Aravindan, when you come to an Aravindan film with this in your head, you don't find it. The film itself isn't that, so there's curious gap that takes place between what you have thought of and what you actually see on the screen, which I want to tease out a little bit. I think it's very important disjuncture that takes place there, right? And I'm saying that in this first Aravindan, there is a political turn that disjuncture seems to take, and I'd like to spend a minute by discussing that. Essentially, the point is this: that there is a political structure, okay, or a language of politics, which the existential figure, the anti-hero, the one who is a cynic, the one who's incapable of political action, can view as corruption. You know, for example, you know, the trade union guy, someone who's sitting and drinking alcohol while spouting radical is an obvious case for being politically critiqued, you know, for someone who has a moral position outside it. But when you look at the disjuncture I'm talking about between the image and the representation, as it were, something else emerges, which is what makes the early Aravindan and the cinema quite significant. And for me, it is this, that the language of politics or political heroism is unable to account for this kind of existential subjectivity, which means that you end up with an existential subjectivity that both is expecting politics to solve this guy's problem, and then looking at the failure of politics as his, as its inability to do what he wants it to do, as it were. You know, I mean, somewhere there is what I wanted to come in on. I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about that kind of disjuncture that I'm talking about, which I think is a cinematic disjuncture and is central to Aravindan's work in a way. You know, when you look at, as you have done both in the introduction and now, when you look at this whole body of work and you're looking at each of these films within that larger body of work, I think something really does come up very centrally. And I think that something does have a political language in this film.
Yeah, there may be two things. One is like, you have similar characters in Malayalam cinema during that period.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you look at a film like, Swapnadam, K.G. George, or Ashwathama by K.R. Mohanan, you can see similar kind of, a hero, who is not connected to any, he is disillusioned, and, he doesn't have any ideals to actually, live for or fight for. So there is that kind of hero who is caught between existentialism and political activism.
Exactly.
So he's there. So that is something that is there in many films, which has been like, if you look at later, you have a lot of films which where Venu Nagoli plays similar kind of hero figure who's you don't know what he wants actually. So he is not able to actually win his love or pursue his love. And there is also a kind of Oedipal layer to it. There is always in conflict with father. Either he is not able to live up to his father's ideals, or he is oppressed by the father. There's a conflict there. That is also a running theme. So I think that there is a kind of the way in which this film you can see in that way. Another thing would be like another film of Aravindan that has this kind of theme of politics is Pokuvel. Where also you find this Baladandran Chollikad character, poet, who is fascinated or is drawn to a radical politics because his friend is an Naxalite or an activist, but he is unable to do anything about it. Like he actually wants to join, but he says, no, wait, you artists have other things to do, like not politics itself. Then he dies. Then there's this poem there and all that. So then he also, if you look at that film, he also goes into a kind of, he totally, he crumbles within, like he becomes, is admitted to a sanatorium and all that. That is how the film ends. So these are two films which actually Aravindan deals explicitly with this, interface or confrontation between politics and existential angst or something like that. So there's a kind of running theme which never gets resolved in any case.
No, I mean, this is really important because I was actually thinking this about exactly the Oedipal, that incredible sequence where the father, Govindan, arrives and then she presents the infant child to him. I mean, actually, the thing is that in the first flashback, she's pregnant.
Yeah.
So the Ravi is not yet born. Then Ravi is born, and then the father arrives the second time, and then she presents the child to the father. And then the third is, of course, the father is dead. And then you get, and you get the soundtrack of the infant Ravi there. So there is a specific Oedipal story that is told here in the context of the freedom struggle. This is something that I think there's been a whole history of how in Indian cinema the idea of freedom as a condition of loss, is something that's quite ubiquitous. And here you end up with a situation where the idea of the freedom struggle as actually the struggle of the father is something that emasculates the son. Yeah. The son is incapable of the kind of political action that the father was, and in a way, it is the orphaning of the son by the freedom struggle, as it were, which has left this particular figure in this condition where he ends up by throwing the mask, as the extent of his sort of radical gesture. Is there? I mean, this is of course very very starkly in opposition to the kind of heroic, tragic, radical figure that you get in, I don't know, Kabani Nadi Chuvannapol and many other films, where you get this kind of heroic structure. There was a certain critique that was made subsequently even to left politics. I mean, the famous example is, of course, Adur Gopalakrishna's Mukhamukham, where, the cynicism or the decay almost of that particular radical history is what is shown. Can you say a little bit about this kind of existential, you mentioned it earlier, this kind of existential figure in terms of a condition of an emasculated male kind of figure who is incapable of action? You mentioned that there were other films at that time that also may have defined this.
Yeah, films of K.G. George, and also Kabani Nadi Chuvannapol also is about a revolutionary who is, who also has similar kind of features, though not exactly the same. And also this Pokuvel has the same kind of conflict. But here, if you look at Uttarayanam, this guru, this master almost becomes a father figure.
Yes.
He's a father figure to him.
Yeah.
But apart from political action, being a political agent, there is also he is also not able to achieve the kind of clarity of thought of the generation. There is also this master figure throughout the film is very clear about what he wants, like whether it be thinking or action. Like he is very, because they are the master and Achu and complement each other. Like one thinks, the other acts, kind of thing. And that kind of clarity is not lost.
Yeah.
You don't have. And the master also doesn't actually ask him to do anything. But like he agrees with the two extremists, the people who are, two young people who come to meet him at the end.
Yes.
He actually is, very much he sees him in them, actually. They are doing what I did at that time. That is what he says. Yeah. But Ravi is not able to connect with anything, anybody.
Absolutely.
And he also sees, when he goes to town, he sees this, city. You have this representative of Prem Kumar, then you have this David, then you have this professor. All these are also possibilities of Ravi becoming someone like that. So he rejects that. Then also he doesn't. That is why when the film came out, there was a lot of, because it came out during emergency. A lot of tension there, and also a lot of people looking forward to some kind of very strong political stand from a film. And this was severely criticized for the end. Like a lot of critics and a lot of writing against the kind of lack of clarity and lack of political stand in the film was hugely criticized during that time. Because this is the kind of stand which is wavering between spiritualism and existential kind of thing, doesn't have any kind of political. It was hugely criticized that time, actually. But when you look back, I think it is much more truthful to the kind of confusion of the times, which reveals it much more poignantly. Though maybe retrospectively it looks like that.
Yeah. I want to, this is Aravindan's book of cartoons. I mean, I've always found it visually fascinating, and yesterday CSV brought me this copy from Kochi. It's a series that actually starts in the early 60s and goes on till the time just before the making of this film. And it tells over this period of time the story of a man called Ramu. And it's called Small Man in the Big World. And it's actually about Ramu and about Master and about a small set of characters. And it actually tells a story going over this 13 years. And then there are all kinds of references to films, and there's a certain kind of a visual style also that you can see in this, involving these characters. And it ends, from what I understood, with them saying that, okay, we're now going to make a film. And then the series ends and Uttarayanam is made. It's an incredible thing to think of, as almost a project that in some form or the other actually evolved from the early 60s and comes into this is something I was unaware of until we spoke about this, because CSV has actually put some images together. If you can just kind of walk us through this, and then I'd like to discuss a little bit about this.
What I have done is, these are actually early images. There are more references to, this is Ramu, and his Master G there. He's a middle-class guy. His father is retired. He has an old mother and father and a sister who is yet to be married. So it's a story of that Ramu and his friends. Master G is just like this, the master we saw in the film. Then he has some friends. Then, one friend who goes to Calcutta, marries a girl there. So he comes once in a while bringing news about, Satyajit Ray. Then his wife comes and sings Rabindra Sangeet. This kind of journey to a typical kind of, in the 70s, Malayali middle class intellectual milieu, which is influenced by Bengali films, a lot of existential classics like Camus, Sartre, and all that. So all those references come in here. They run a library where they buy books. Then they go for film shows. So what I have done is I've picked some, images which have film references. So 5 or 6. Because throughout this thing, like in the first half especially, you have a lot of references to film. Then Ramu gradually, in the beginning, there's a struggle to find a job. Then he goes to interviews, gets rejected. Just like this film, you can see him going to interview, not getting the job, disappointed, taking recommendation letters to someone to get a job, he doesn't get. Then he gets some temporary jobs, leave vacancies, 3 months job to teach in a tutorial in a school and all that. So those are the situations. Each, Aravindan followed the 6-frame format throughout. All the 13 years, it was like this. Only thing that changes is, like, if you look, these are early images actually, this is 61 actually. So there are too many characters, this, very crowded kind of frames. As you go to the end, it becomes very, sparse. A lot of, blank spaces. And even the face of Ramu itself is not completely shown. It's actually at the edge and all that. So a lot of negatives or, blank spaces fill the frame. And that journey is also, it is also a journey of Ramu of, him becoming lonely, because he loses his ideals. He compromises with a lot of things to hold on to his job, and his values change. So it's also a kind of desertion of other things around him. Like his master becomes almost absent by the end. So his world becomes deserted in that sense. He becomes a kind of part of the corporate world. Then getting into a lot of other things and all that. So these are some of the references, earlier references. There is one scene where they are going to watch this film Teen Kanya by Satyajit Ray, and they have this kind of there's nobody to watch the film, only they are there. So there are no good no audience for good films. It's a kind of film society response. I think this is again this is Bengali, his friend from Bengal coming with his wife. Then they want to go for a Malayalam movie. Then he asks, "You're from the land of Satyajit Ray. Why get disappointed? Don't." He says, "What is there to see in Malayalam cinema? Because you come from Bengal." again, this is about, about his comment on, there's a La Dolce Vita, they are visiting a city and they watch films. He goes to Trivandrum, I think, yeah.
Some of the characters in the film Uttarayanam can evoke some of the slightly caricatural quality. I mean, the policeman, for example,
Yeah.
or the bodybuilder, and there'd be a certain set of characters who actually do have that slightly
cartoonish yeah.
quality to it, which is there. But it's very difficult for me to relate this Ramu to Ravi. Or is there?
Not exactly, no. This Ramu is actually somebody who struggles to survive. He wants to find a job, and he's also interested in arts and all that. But as the story progresses, he becomes much more, totally away from these, bookshops and book references, film and all that, and he gets into a kind of corporate kind of thing. That is his, evolution as a character. By the time all these friends also disappear from his life. Then he gets into other kinds of companies and all that. That is how it works. But there are also many characters here, like you have a typical LIC agent in it who appears. Actually, that LIC agent appears in Chidambaram. You can see a similar kind of character in Chidambaram. But there are a lot of, one thing about this cartoon series is it's a continuous story. It's a kind of graphic novel that ran for 13 years. I think it has never happened anywhere in the world. I don't think. And he doesn't get very old, but ages. Most of the cartoon, if you look at the long cartoon series, they never get aged, the cartoon figures. Here is a character who gets aged, who also grows with time.
You mentioned Thikodian and the kind of theatre context. For me, the other question, the related question, and of course the obvious parallel to, we keep inevitably at some point of time talking about John Abraham, the topic does come up. But this idea of what I would call an ensemble film, a film made by a collective, film made by a number of people who come together to make this happen. And I think that this film is a little bit like that. There are two things there. One is the kind of people who came together to make the film. And what I understand is that some of these people, Thikodian and others, actually had a plan to make a film even before Aravindan comes in on that. So that's one aspect of the collective. And second is a particular kind of collective memory. So there are specific references to specific characters. So this is not an abstract story of the Indian freedom struggle. This actually refers to a particular incident involving a particular bomb blast and a particular set of characters to whom references are made. So it's the kind of grounding, in a way, of that film within specific collective memories, which also defines the collective. So two registers of collective. One is the people who made the film, and the second is a kind of a recall of a certain political history that brings them together. And I was wondering whether you say a little bit about collectives in this sense, especially as it relates to Aravindan. That's not something one associates with Aravindan. Adur we know was the Chitralekha context, and of course John we know, and there are other kinds of structures of collectives. But this early Aravindan in this particular structure was an unusual discovery for me.
Actually, Aravindan was part of this lot of film society initiatives, right, in Kottayam, and later he was closely associated with Ashwini Film Society in Calicut. So Aravindan was actually a rubber board employee. He was, when he began this small men, big world, he was in Kodamangalam. He was in, Kottayam district, his hometown, his home district. Then he comes to Calicut in 1964. Then he stays there for a long time. So in Calicut, they already had a kind of, lot of, for instance, Thikodian is one person who has done a lot of plays, who's written novels, stories, plays, and there was a very vibrant theatre movement happening in Malabar actually, with K.T. Mohammed doing and huge, highly successful, popular plays being, performed. So Thikodian was part of it. Then again, in and around Aravindan, they used to meet every day. Like, there was MT there, who was also instrumental in, carrying this cartoon in he was editor of Madhurabhumi Weekly. So he was also instrumental in promoting Aravind and giving him space there. Then they were all meeting together. Then you have Nambudiri, who is the art director of this film. So they were all, the film naturally was part of their, this is what is, written about by many others who were there during that time. Like Chelur Venu, one of the key figures of the Ashwini Film Society, which was established in 64 actually. The year Aravindan arrives there, Film Society started there. So there is a lot of discussions about, other literature, arts, and also about film. So they were actually planning to make a film. So they thought we should make a film, and Pattathola Karnagaran was an employee of P.S. Leslie. He said he will produce the film. So Tikodian was supposed to write the story, and Aravindan was part of the team. Then they thought, who will direct the film? Then they first approached Adur to do it. Adur came and discussed, and Adur said, why me? Like, you can, you ask Aravindan to do it. Aravindan is a good choice to make a film, make this film. That is how, then the Tikudin and Aravindan wrote this story, because then naturally a lot of Aravindan characters came into that story. But the basic event that this refers to, Bomb Blast, was actually a real event, which happened in 43 in Calicut, between Calicut and Koilandi. He's from Koilandi, he comes to Calicut to plant this bomb and all that. So that is a real kind of event. But this, the group which made the film, Pattathola Karnagaran and Tikodian, both very established writers. Then you have Nambudiri, who is illustrated for Madhurabhumi, who has been, the art direction. All these, the sketches that you see in the credit cards are by Nambudiri. It tries to tell the whole story through sketches. Then music, again, Devarajan Mash did the songs, and M.B. Srinivasan did the background score for the film. So all these were part of, and also actors. For instance, except for Sukumaran and Mallika, who comes from outside, they were just, these are their first films actually. They were to become, Sukumaran became a big star later. Again, Vijayan, who plays David, was again Aravindan's friend, and he was in Kodambaka for a long time. He did a film by himself. Then all the other actors like Kunyandi, Balanke Nair, Shanda Devi, all of them are actually associated with theatre movement in Malabar. So they were natural choices for Tikodian to act in actually. So that is, so this is a kind of collective effort in that sense. All of them came together to make the film. But from that moment, I think if you look at the next Aravindan, second Aravindan, nothing to do with any of these, these kinds of associations. Though he shifts to a totally different kind of, filmmaking pattern actually. Everything changes, I would say. Because there is no resemblance between this and Kanchanasida. No. Nothing at all. Very few. You won't find any kind of connection. In terms of style, in terms of, cinematography, compositions, everything is different.
Sir, you're talking about that ashram and Guruji here. And there is another, I think he made a documentary on Jiddu Krishnamurti also later. What do you think about this, especially at that time, this Gurujis and this relationship with Aravindan, sir?
Aravindan throughout his life was very much into spirituality. Actually, he was. Oh, okay. His favorite book was Saundarya Lahari. You can see that in the film. It is there actually. Saundarya Lahari is there. Like he used to recite it in full, and he could remember the whole text. So he was very this thing about that. So he always had this kind of spiritual trips. In many films, you can see this resurfacing again and again about.
From the usually that time, most filmmakers, I think they took a left stand basically.
But not directly. Aravindan was never part of, even Adur was never directly part of the left movement or anything like that. Though Aravindan later part of his life was a symbolic presence in many leftist rallies and all that. But otherwise, he was not very keen on that. And he was severely criticized by the left actually. If you look at the leftist critics writing on Aravindan, they had a lot of problems with Aravindan.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you.
So it's not exactly a criticism of Aravindan or the movie, So I wanted to ask, like, I understand the existentialism he's exploring through the character of Ravi and the, disillusion he has with how the world has changed, or like, he can't be part of this, how India is, or like what is happening. That I get it. But here, we see this very Gandhian, especially in the freedom movement time, we see this Gandhian followers, and then we see this struggle with Gandhian followers and Bhagat Singh followers, which is also reflected when he also grows up, right? Like, he talks about Che Guevara and all that. So in all this politics, like, what I felt was it became too much of a, I don't know how to put it in a very nice way. So it became too much of an Nair Nambudari Brahmin film for me. And I felt myself or my community, or like, say, missing in the film or not represented. Like, say, Ambedkar was absent in the film. This wouldn't have been a problem, say, in a film that is self-critical or a film that is about something else. But here the film is talking about India and independence, right? So when these topics come, I feel like that representation matters, and as a viewer, I'm offended while watching it. So what do you think about that? How relevant the film is for 70% of India? It is very relevant for 30% of India. What about the remaining 70%?
Yeah, if you look at the representation of, even if you look at the whole of Aravindan's films, they were all about certain kinds of communities, as you say, like educated, upper class kind of milieu that he was talking about, except for films like Orestapan was set in Latin Catholic milieu. There's a different kind of film. But for that, if you look at the representative women in this film, they're totally, there's no agency there. They just suffer, they wait. They're totally at the margins. They're not actors at all. They don't act. They're just, silent. He doesn't even answer properly. They, throughout all the generations of, there is a grandmother, then his mother, then there's his love there. And they're all marginal to the whole narrative. They're not part of the soul, his existential angst or the political, this thing that he has. That is there. Like, when you look back, this becomes very striking also. And also if you look at, whole of Aravindan film, you won't find the Muslim community at all. Very few. Like, even in this, he looks, in the train journey, he has a Muslim couple, sharing some snacks, and he smiles at them. Otherwise, then another Muslim character is the one who comes with the contractor, is a political leader, come contractor. There's a kind of nexus between politics and business. There he's shown. So there's a very stereotypical kind of thing. Otherwise, he doesn't, it's actually totally, for instance, if you look at a film like Tambu, it looks like a Hindu island, Hindu upper caste island it is. You won't find even anybody else there. So that is the kind of milieu that that Aravindan showed in his films. And when you look back, it becomes very, very striking, actually. Strikes you in the face, like, why is it like that? That is your...
But I'm not against somebody telling their own story. I mean, he comes from that background. He likes talking about that. But in the context of the film, I felt very alienated as a viewer. Yeah.
I want to come in on this actually, and thank you for that question. I'm obviously not that familiar with the intricacies of the situation in Kerala, but making a larger point, and this we were talking about the larger point. This entire question of the existential hero, which is, we sort of established in even the duration of this 3 screenings, interview, 27 down in this film, prevails in a lot of independent cinema at this point of time and becomes a very significant political figure. It is intended by the filmmakers to be a significant political figure representing that time, okay? Now, what remains, I mean, we talked about it a little bit over lunch as well. So 2 things there. One is that it does seem that this was a condition that Kumar Shahani, I mentioned it in the last this thing, describes the condition of anomie, and he talks about it in his own films. Anomie is a term that comes from Emil Durkheim and is to do with a certain kind of terminal indifference. You're actually indifferent to suffering, you're indifferent to exploitation, you actually are incapable of political action. And I think that, so what I was actually surprised by is that Rajni Kothari, in this very famous book called Politics in India, it's a definitive book actually in the 60s of politics, actually speaks of anomie as a concept that he wants to bring in to define Indian politics. So it's a very specific sort of situation. Now, here comes my agreement with what you're saying, that this kind of anomic, indifferent figure, the figure who is so completely, if you like, suffused with self-doubt or self-insecurity that he can never act, is A, typically an upper caste figure, B, typically a male figure. Okay? And you mentioned again very interestingly over lunch, when you're talking about these figures who are suffused with moral doubt, you mentioned Anantamurthy. And Anantamurthy, of course, brings caste in very much, but that's it's a particular sort of Brahmin figure who has his own internal moral doubt. You're right to the extent that I do want to ask as to whether this kind of condition of moral existential doubt is possible for a Dalit protagonist. And I'd like us to, I know in Marathi, for example, which I know a little bit better, I'd find it be a hard place to figure out this kind of modernist aesthetic around this condition of terminal doubt, or this idea of being oppressed, if you like, by the freedom struggle or by the patriarchal, the father figure, very, very much so in this thing. Mahesh Alkunchwar's Garbo becomes a case in point. There are many other examples that we could think of. But you're right in the sense that, there really aren't female characters. What happens in all of these films, whether it is Ranjit Malik in Interview, or the figure that M.K. Raina plays in 27 Down, or this figure, they're incapable of even sexual action. They cannot have a conjugal relationship with a woman. These particular sorts of existential male figures, they are so completely stuck in a situation. And I think it's a significant point to make, but I do think that it is a position that can be critiqued on grounds of caste. So to that extent, I agree with you. That's the point you're making, right?
Like for me, it became more about I was talking about the whole idea of India and India falling down. So I'm not against somebody talking about existentialism, and existentialism becomes a privileged, not just here, right? Like even when we talk about Western films, it's mostly Antonioni and Fellini who explode it at their best, right? Like because it becomes a privileged folks thing, a kind of escape, or they have this nihilistic attitude and they're existential about everything. My criticism was that, when you're talking about a particular subject, in that this politics becomes important.
Okay.
Like especially here is talking about country, nation, India, and what is India without its people. So for me, the freedom struggle and Gandhi and Bhagat Singh, Ambedkar also needs to have that space or place there.
Again, to add to what you were saying about is it possible to have a Dalit character like that who is introspective like this? But I think in the Malayalam Kerala situation, it was possible actually, because post people like Poigela Pachan and Ayangali and Narayana Guru and Kumar Nasan, it is possible because their works are highly introspective and they deal with all these questions very, very so there is no continuation in that that in film in any case. Maybe that is something to do with film also, the medium of film also.
Yeah. It is something to do with film, because one of the things that I've been very interested in, again, is the fact of how the kind of independent Indian cinema, extremely political, simply does not fit into the languages of politics that prevailed in India at that time. And so the kinds of divides that take place, for example, between what we call the middle of the road cinema or the independent cinema, and of course these are divides that then get reproduced in different regions. The divides that, for example, the left criticism of Aravindan is along, I imagine, along fairly established fault lines. I mean, you can see why the left would be critical of Aravindan, or why somebody who would actually take a modernist position from poetry and so on would be equally critical of the left or their inability to accommodate this. I mean, for example, I mean, one of the things that we were talking about it again, that P. Sundaraiah, I'm changing the subject to Kerala, to Telangana. P. Sundaraiah's famous book on the Telangana people's struggle and its lessons shows how utterly blind the Communist Party was to questions of sexuality, for example. How utterly blind they were to questions of individual suffering, for instance. I mean, the only definition that they had, the only political language that they had was along a certain idea of struggle. So this is, in its very nature, something that can be critiqued from some position outside it, which I was asking CSV as to whether in the early 70s, it was possible to call yourself left without being affiliated to any political organization. You said it was. And that, of course, is another question. The idea of an unaffiliated left who can say, well, I am on the left, but I don't believe in or belong to any of these parties. So I am completely and totally able to occupy an independent position on this. It's a relatively recent development, I think, in India to do this. But you said that this was possible at that point.
It was possible, basically, because if you look at the history of communist parties in Kerala, you had all kinds of groups. You have Trotskys, you have Lin Piawas, and all kinds of people like. Right. So you had this kind of, you had, apart from critiquing CPA and CPM, these Chinese and Russian lines, there are a lot of parties in between CPA, CPM, and CPML. There are a lot of other parties, Trotskys, socialists, whole range of spectrum of leftists who are not with the powerful, these two, CPA, CPM, nor were they, the extremists like CPML. So this discussion was always happening in Kerala. So there is this position of being left without being a party member was possible.
So the other question I was asking you was that unfortunately he takes a bit of a hit in this film, but the teacher, the guy who is talking about Che Guevara and all that. Now he is slightly caricatured in the film, but if you were to slightly de-caricature him in the film, would that be a kind of an unaffiliated pro-ML kind of figure?
In a sense.
The one who would be reading his Che Guevara, the one who would be looking at Bolivia and saying that, yes, armed struggle is the only way forward, but not in any way. So in a way, the arrival of the Naxalite movement also does lead to the possibility of an imagined unaffiliated left position that would argue for things like armed struggle.
I always felt that, if you look at the Naxalite movement in Kerala, the Naxalite actions in Kerala, there were very few actually. Also, of a very short span of time, like 68, 71 kind of thing, 2-3 attacks. And, people were, whole set of people were jailed. And there were torture, all those things. But it happened much more cruelly during the emergency time. But you had these two key iconic figures. One is Varghese, who was killed by the police, who becomes the figure of the martyr, almost equated with Che and all that, because he was also found dead in Wayanad. Then another is Ajita, the iconic figure of her, being put up in front of the police station after she was caught from the jungle, from the forest. She was actually exhibited in front of the police station. This is an iconic photograph that came in all the papers, where she was, with the pants and, a blouse, she stands, helpless, and people jeering at her, and, all these policemen standing behind her. Sort of thing. That is one figure. The other figure is this Varghese figure. So the kind of mythology that has been built around it is much huge kind of thing. A lot of, literature, writing, references to that becomes, is much larger than what actually happened. And, and during emergency, there was a lot of, things happening because they were all arrested and they were the people who most suffered, like, CPML, workers and also sympathizers were the people. But the kind of legends and mythology surrounding it is much larger than what actually happened.
Anyone? Yeah.
So I have two things to say. One about the English speaking audience, characters in the movie. So I think it sounds obvious, but what I feel is the director wants to establish the contrast between the urban setting and the rural setting where the protagonist grew up. And another thing is the fight is basically to remove the English. I mean, not as a language, but the entire culture of English. That's what the nationalist movement was. That's my opinion. And the another thing is about existentialism with respect to the lead character. In this movie, we see the protagonist who is educated. He is financially better. I mean, from most of the Dalits or all of the Dalits from that period. His idea of existentialism is not fitting into society in a different way. He is hinting at the arts field not being relevant in the job market. See, that's a different kind of fitting into society. But what a Dalit character might feel is the acceptance that society has towards. His existentialism might be a question of survival, I guess. Survival in the society and being one with the society. That's what I feel.
When you say that, it's only survival they're thinking about, I mean, it's not necessary, right? Like, even a poor man can be having existential thoughts and maybe he just doesn't have an escape, or even if there is, we haven't seen it on screen yet. But when you're saying, we have to look at a Dalit only from a particular point of view of his survival or his acceptance, you're limiting it. You're limiting a human experience. So humans feel existential for a lot of reasons, right?
No, I mean, there's a specific definition to existentialism, which if you want a very, just in this phrase, it's, the assumption that the fact of existence precedes the meaning of existence. So the meaning of life is something that can follow. You're not born on this planet with a purpose. You're born on this planet, and that's a fact. But then you have to find whether there's any purpose to that being born, or whether your existence has no meaning. This is essentially related to the idea of all of us individuals being unique subjects with a unique subjectivity, and the struggle that we would have to discover that inner subjectivity, and the failure to do that, which is typically the crisis of existentialism. Now, it is true that the arts may be one way of doing it, but it's also politics. There could be other ways by which you might, to use another term, self-actualize, through whatever means are available to you, or very often fail to do so. In which case you become, as Kamu would have it, the outsider, the stranger, someone who is expelled, or to use today's terms, cancelled, from society, who is actually someone for whom society has no place. So it doesn't, the problem with it is that it cannot be a kind of a finger pointing exercise saying it's all your fault because you found me no place. And the problem with it is also you don't know whether, again to use the term self-doubt, this terminal self-doubt leads you to ask as to whether the problem you're facing is a problem that society has placed on you, or is a problem you have created, because of your own inner failure. So this continuous sense of an inner failure, saying that I actually failed and it is totally my fault and I can't blame anybody else for it, that would be where the existential fault line would typically come, I think. So I mean, there would be a whole sort of poetics. I mean, you mentioned, the whole history of, that would go back to that time. But specifically, I suppose the modernist literature, which would be reading their Camus, their Samuel Beckett, the Sartre, and so on, would be very fascinated by those kinds of concerns. And as you said earlier, they would be featuring in the language of the early 70s. Okay, so again, a long and very interesting discussion. And any last concluding thoughts, questions?
One thing I was thinking about was, a reference from here. There's also a sense of asceticism among the left in the 1950s and 1960s, which is not discussed enough, especially in the context of Kerala. That's something I thought should make a reference here. the kind of asceticism, because I think in Bengal it is being worked enough, but in Kerala I think there's a lot that has to be discussed.
Yeah, so self-imposed asceticism that a comrade has to follow,
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah. But this left melancholy is there, like it is a running kind of theme. If you look at Malayalam cinema through the eyes of the idea of communism, you can see the whole, history of communism through Malayalam cinema. You can see the early films like Ningalane Communistaki, where there's huge hopes about communist movement as a liberating force. Then you have a lot of films about peasant struggles and all that, early films. Then you have this, films like Mukhamukam and, films that actually is very circumspect about the movement becoming a party becoming part of this political power games sort of thing. Then you have films like Amarya, and then you have films, which looks back at almost communism, the ideals becomes the past, just like what Ravi feels about, freedom struggle becomes, for him, communist movement becomes a kind of, nostalgic past kind of thing. Then you can see this in these 90s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Perestroika, all these figuring in Malayalam cinema.
Right.
You can take some 6-7 Malayalam films and you look at the history of communist movement. Actually, you can see all the phases in that, right from hopes to struggles with power and how it gets disconnected. Unionism was a big theme. Then this whole fall of Soviet Union was a big thing in. You can see many films dealing with that loss of that fatherland. And also this looking back in the recent films, you can see, for instance, film like Priyadarshan's film. What is his name? It's actually about an old communist looking back at his life. So you can see the reflections of this, the idea or ideal of communism through Malayalam cinema, and many films have actually dealt with that in different ways. It'll be interesting way to look at, curate a package of films of
that
cinema,
time. Yes.
And also
Okay,
for the
sorry.
political subjects here, the character played by Premji, I think we can also make, I think Rajivan's movie also, I think...
Margam.
Margam,
Yeah. M. Sukumaran's story, that is.
Yeah. So I think there is also a contrast about, Gandhian, towards the end of the movie, we also have, how a Naxal becomes a Gandhian later towards the end, and, you can see.
Okay. If
Amarian,
there's no other comments or questions, once again, let me really thank CSV for coming.
Thank you for this.
And I hope we can see you again when we do this John thing for sure, and then other occasions as well. I want to thank Vinayak and the Bangalore Film Forum, and of course MAP friends for making this happen. So thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you all. Thank you.